This talkie is really going to be about land art or earth art. However, before we look at examples of that, I think we need to ask some questions about how we get there. And it really, I think, begins with the evolution from abstract expressionism. In the United States, our first true style, born here and spreading from here around the globe, placing us internationally on the map, is abstract expressionism. And it does begin in New York City. There are two branches of it, the action painters, and that would be folks like Jackson Pollock. We'll cruise past a picture of Pollock in a moment, working in a very gestural and heavily painted way. And then there will be the color field painters, individuals who are interested in studying the impact of blocks of color on the canvas. This is going to be the first time that America truly has a voice and influences the rest of the world. It happens to coincide with the decline of Paris as the center of the art world, which follows the invasion of the Nazis in 1940. Consequently, the art center of the entire world, at least for a while, is focused in New York City. Today, there's more than one place where new ideas are arising and influencing the world of art. However, New York still continues to play an amazingly important role in that process. Just a reminder that Jackson Pollock, in many ways, is the leader of gestural or action painting. He actually gets into his canvases, stepping on them. They're very large in scale. This is one of the features of abstract expressionism. They're charged with personal energy from Jackson Pollock. And one of the features of abstract expressionism, in fact, becomes the fact that the paintings record the presence of the artist. Sometimes for Pollock, it might include his cigarette butt or his ashes, which fall down, his sweat, or a paint cap or nails that he might be playing around with in terms of supporting the canvas or other work in the studio. So anything is fair game. If it's associated with Pollock in a personal way, it becomes a part of the composition. These paintings, so filled with, I'm going to say, angst and power. Here's a closer look. Heavily laden with interlacing webs of paint that almost seem to be fighting with each other, do seem to record Pollock's own state of mind. They become then a kind of a mythic document of the tortured artist, and that becomes part of the baggage of abstract expressionism. Okay, we do have an understanding that Pollock got some idea, perhaps not all of his ideas, but some of his ideas from Navajo sand painting. Navajo sand painting is done very close to the earth by pouring, in this case, colored sand, but it was also used for curing. And we do think that Jackson Pollock also used his pictures for curing, but for curing himself, that they became an expression of his own emotions that he was able to vent onto the canvas. In another branch of abstract expressionism, we do have color field painting. And probably my favorite color field painter is Mark Rothko, who works with floating, usually floating rectangles of color that bleed into each other, creating a very, very meditative kind of composition, almost ethereal in nature, as if it's receding into the space in front of you. A Rothko painting, a good Rothko painting, is one you will want to sit down in front of a museum, spend a few minutes, and meditate on the composition itself. For Rothko, these paintings expressed emotions, and they were often, again, for Rothko, very personal emotions. So even a color field painting, which might seem very rational, because after all, it is blocks of color, these paintings were created in a very personal, mythic, heroic way, conveying and sharing with the viewer the emotions and feelings of the artist. Mark Rothko also is one of the abstract expressionists who will commit suicide. So we do know that he had a troubled life and that some of his emotions were actually conveyed through his paintings. The power of abstract expressionism is realized in the vast number of reactions to it. There is pop, which we're looking at right here. These are examples by Andy Warhol, as well as minimalism, two incredibly important and I'm going to say art changing movements that take place in the early 20th century. In addition to variations of post painterly abstraction by a number of artists, all excuse me, all of these artists are attempting to break away from the heavy emotions that go into abstract expressionist work, the personal connection between the artist and the work of art. Andy Warhol for pop is probably the best example to show that break by turning to mass produced images that come from a consumer based society. Warhol would say, if you asked him what's the meaning of my art, he would say, "Oh, it has no meaning." So that he's showing us something drawn from our own consumer society. Now, we can step back and ask questions about that consumer society, but Warhol is not telling us to do that. So it is a very impersonal, mechanically created form of art that Warhol is giving us, and it is intended to be visually detached from the artist. Now, I don't think that's entirely possible, but I do think that is one of the goals of pop art, and Warhol is one of the best at this. There are many pop artists, many variations of pop. One of the most famous that you probably are already familiar with is Robert Indiana, and this is his Love, which you can see in Philadelphia in Love Park in Philly. What inspired Robert Indiana is also from popular culture, letters and words that you see along the roadside, in particular billboards. He takes those letters, which do carry a kind of meaning, but in a very, I'm going to say, pop cultural context, and he blows them up. One of the features of pop art, like abstract expressionism, is to take something and make it enlarged. That would be true for Warhol's soup cans, which are no longer small, but become several feet in height. Enlarging and by doing that, drawing our attention to the image. The same is going to be true for Indiana. Similarly, Roy Lichtenstein, another American pop artist, is going to blow up images he finds in comic books. He's going to blow them up larger in scale, turn them into artworks, partly by size, but also partly by slight adjustments that he makes to them. So it's not exactly stealing, it is taking, appropriating, borrowing, and altering along the way. But it is based upon something that we find in our popular culture. Just to let you know how seriously these art styles have been taken, this is a Roy Lichtenstein and it's his Sleeping Girl, I believe. It sold at auction in 2010 at Sotheby's for $44.8 million. So the Americans have definitely arrived, not just the abstract expressionists, but also the pop artists, and as we'll see in a moment, the minimalists. Minimalism is also a reaction to abstract expressionism, and generally speaking, it's going to be one of the more challenging art forms for folks to come to terms with and accept as art. You often walk into a museum, look at this stuff, and say, "Why is this here?" What the minimalists were trying to do, and they're going to emerge in the 60s and 70s, particularly the 70s, primarily in the United States. So it again is a style that belongs to us. What they're kind of trying to do is reduce the object to its essentials, and that can be painting. It can also be sculpture, to reducing it to its basic geometric, abstract, and simplest forms. One of the great exponents of this is Donald Judd, and you can see one of his works. Often the minimalists don't even title these, which can make it a little difficult to identify to find them. If I say, okay, this is untitled number one, untitled number two, etc. But they're trying to strip away everything that gives meaning to the art so that the viewer can look at it and interpret the object purely on its own, taking away all reference to the artist, all signs of the hand of the artist. So, in comparison to a Jackson Pollock, which has lots of drip marks all over the surface, this is spar. There's nothing there at all. In fact, Donald Judd doesn't even make these things. He gives dimensions and materials, and he sends this off to be constructed by someone else, and then comes back and arranges the component parts into a single whole. But it is the viewer who has to put those pieces together to make meaning out of the object. The piece that is on our right is one you can see in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it's a classic example of minimalism that was crafted by a man whose name is Sol LeWitt. Like the work by Donald Judd, it has no pedestal or frame, so that it's being, I'm going to say, disconnected from the traditional world of art. You have to judge what you see completely on its own without any interpretation by the artist. It does consist, and the official title of this is One Blue Ceiling, 8 Geometric Figures. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it was done in 1981. When you go here, first of all, you have to find it. It's on the ceiling. So many people might even miss it. But when you do, you have to engage in putting these geometric shapes together on your own, creating meaning or perhaps visual appreciation for the object by yourself. It is rejecting all of the personal connections that were associated with abstract expressionists and their works of art. Sol LeWitt and the piece in the Philly Museum that we're looking at is also interesting because it is an example of concept art also. And this helps us to see how these areas overlap, and it becomes very difficult to say, oh, Sol LeWitt is simply a minimalist. He's more than that. He's also a concept artist because what he did was to sell the idea, which is for LeWitt's purposes, the creation itself, the diagram, the design of this. He sold that to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He did not literally engage in making this at the museum. Instead, it was made by some of his assistants and some of the nice folks at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Not only that, but since they own the idea, if they want to, they can erase this. They can take it completely off the ceiling and they can move it down the hall and they can redo it again. So it is the idea or the concept that is important in terms of the artist's creation. This does come hand in hand with minimalism, but it also can be traced back to Marcel Duchamp, who claimed that it's not the object that's the artwork, it's the idea in the head of the artist to create it. And that would apply to Duchamp's fountain as well as any of his other ready-mades. It is through minimalism and concept art that artists are able to experiment and come up with ideas for what we might come to call earth art or land art. This is by Richard Long. It is located also from time to time in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It is made out of stones, which Long collected and brought into the museum and arranged them in this pattern. They are placed on the floor, no pedestal, no frame, nothing like that. It does belong to the world of minimalism, but it also is Long's idea, so it's related to concept. And in addition to that, because it is a part of the earth, made from earth materials, it is associated with land art or earth art, and it's there that I would like to take us next.